This is Inverse Happy Hour, and we've got a very special guest, Christopher Paolini, author of a ton of awesome books, and starting with the Inheritance series, and he's got a new one coming out this year called, I have it right here, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars.
Yeah.
Chris, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm super excited to be talking about this book.
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of questions, and if you're listening, please send us your questions. We want Chris to answer as many questions from fans as possible, both about this book, and if you have stuff about the old book, he can talk about some of his previous work too, although we're all very excited about the new one. Yeah, to kick things off, so you're known for fantasy, you got the sword, but this is a science fiction book. So I'm curious, why did you decide to shift? What is it about science fiction that interests you?
Well, if you take a close look at the books behind me, you'll see that most of them are science fiction. I love science fiction. I grew up reading as much sci-fi as fantasy as a kid. And, you know, to me, science fiction is the fiction of the future. You know, it tells us what could be, what we might accomplish as a species, and can serve as both hope and warning. And I love it. And it's something that I've always wanted to write. And, you know, it's always shelved together in the bookstores anyway. So, you know, if you read fantasy, the sci-fi is right there, and it's a very easy transition for me. Although I think the biggest difference is that in science fiction, if you want to get to a location faster, you can't just tell the spaceships to go faster. You know, it's not like a horse. You can't dig your spurs in.
Well, there's always space horses, right? You know, you always
as Star Wars proved to us.
Yes, as Star Wars proved, there are space horses. We got our first question from a regular guest, John Koval, a regular viewer, John Koval, who wants to know what inspires you to differentiate the themes between your different books.
1 second, I'm trying to adjust my camera here just a little bit. Well, I mean, I have my own private obsessions as a person, as an author, and I think that's true of most authors, themes that I continue to return to. But the themes of individual books are really determined by the nature of the main character, you know, what their flaws are, what their concerns are, what their philosophy is. And that really shapes my approach to the story. But of course, I have to write about things that I'm interested in, so I find myself returning to the same sort of handful of topics again and again.
Yeah, I think I was doing some research on this new book, and I think you listed Alien, the movie, as an inspiration.
Oh, yeah.
Which, huge fan. I'm curious, obviously that's like a pretty scary movie. How scary, how sort of horrorcore is this book?
It's not horror. It's more, I mean, it's a sci-fi opera. I'm not going to lie. There are definitely some intense and hopefully some scary bits in this book, but it's not a horror novel. If I write a horror novel, I will not attempt to hide it. But the things that I liked in Alien are probably more like the scene. I don't want to spoil things in my own novel. I don't want to spoil the effect I'm going for. But some of the world building, some of the mood that was evoked that's separate from the horror itself is stuff I've always admired. And some of my other big inspirations for this book, of course, were Dune, the Hyperion series by Dan Simmons, a whole whackload of Ray Bradbury, Asimov, Clarke, all the classics, a lot of Ursula Le Guin. So not that I think that this book will necessarily stand with them, but I hope it's my best effort at writing a love letter to that genre.
Nice. As a Dune fan, I'm sure you've been following these new movie photos that they've been releasing. Have you seen those?
They're so gray.
Too gray for you? Yeah, I mean, where's the sand, right?
I mean, I'm actually partially colorblind, so I appreciate more monochrome images. But that said, I'm really, really curious. I mean, I think everyone who's a fan of the book has been hoping to see another adaptation. But that said, I'm actually going to put a word in to defend David Lynch's adaptation of the book for one specific reason.
I mean, doesn't really need to be defended. It's great. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it's a lot of people like to bash it.
Sure.
But for me, it's so many movies attempt to feel epic, and fail miserably. Even with giant epics and all the advantages you can have, they try to feel like an epic, and they don't feel like an epic. Mm-hmm. And that original David Lynch Dune film, it feels like an epic. It feels strange and weird and awesome. And I'm really hoping that that sense of weirdness, which is sort of key to a lot of the Dune universe, is preserved in the new version.
Yeah, it definitely has it looks big. It looks like it has a lot of scale, so I'm excited for that. All right, we've got some more questions from the audience. And if you're watching it, this is Inverse Happy Hour with Chris Paolini. I'm Jake. We're taking questions, talking about his new book, old books. Someone wants to know, do you have any advice for young writers? As a former young writer, what would you tell people who are young and want to write their first book?
Embrace the discomfort. Accept that you are going to write bad sentences, bad paragraphs, bad chapters, bad characters, maybe even bad books, and that's okay. That's actually a really natural part of the process. If you look at examples of editing from any well-known author, whether it's me or Stephen King or pick anyone, you'll see that authors will rip their sentences apart. They will rip their fiction apart in an attempt to make better. So if you can accept right up front that writing a bad sentence does not make you a bad author, you have a massive advantage. But in more practical terms, I would say learn everything you can about the language, plot your stories out beforehand, because that's going to make a huge, huge difference. Really, really make sure you understand the story well enough that you could sit down around a campfire and tell it to your friends before you start writing it. Because if you can't articulate the story, if you can't verbalize it, you don't actually understand it. And a good idea does not a story make. A young man finding a dragon egg in the forest, or a xenobiologist finding an alien artifact is not a story. It's an idea, and it's a cool idea.
Yeah.
But that's all it is. That's not a story.
Interesting. I like it.
And then, write about the things you love the most. Sure.
Yeah, that's always good advice. We've got a lot of people asking a similar question, which is, and maybe you don't know yet, is this going to be a new series? Do you have more stories in this world you want to tell?
Well, I've had lots of people asking me, is it a standalone novel or is it a series? To which I have a definitive answer, and I'm happy to share it with you now.
Yeah?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. I see where you're going with that.
It is a universe that I hope to tell many more stories in. But more than that, readers will have to see when they read the book.
Got it. We just got a question coming in, which is, I think, an interesting one. How do you think the pacing of your new book compares to your previous work in the Inheritance series?
I mean, it's not massively different in the sense that I'm the same person. So
sure.
My preference towards storytelling remains the same. But it is also different in the fact that it is, this is a small spoiler, but it's an attempt to basically write an entire series in one book in a lot of ways. So the pacing is different than you would find in any of my other novels. I think more happens. This book is about the length of my last big novel, Inheritance, and substantially more happens in this book. So we'll see. We'll see how people feel about that pacing. I published a book of short stories about a year ago called The Fort of the Worm. So I've managed to sort of bridge the giant novels and the tiny short stories, and it's actually done my fiction some good.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, in a way, short stories are tougher, aren't they? I did want to ask about that. What prompted that shift to try a book of short stories, and how did you think it was different from writing a novel?
I mean, the big challenge is just trying to wrap up the whole story in less than 1,000 pages, and then the reason for it is just I keep getting all these story ideas, and if each one is going to be a 1,000-page novel, I'd never write all of them. So the short stories is a nice way to, and some of these ideas might not sustain a 1,000-page novel. So the short stories are a nice way to work my way through them, get some stuff out for the readers, revisit the world, and have some fun.
Nice. I like it. A little exercise.
Yeah.
Here's another one from the audience. And again, if you're watching, this is Inverse Happy Hour with Chris Paolini. Feel free to send us your questions in the comments, which everyone's asking, so I have to relay it, which is any updates on the fifth Inheritance book, on that series?
Well, first of all, I'm planning on writing more of the collections of short stories set within the world. So that's
Nice.
something I hope to tackle before too long. Book 5, which would be the next major work set in the Inheritance cycle,
Exactly.
set in the world, is something that I'm hoping to tackle sooner rather than later. But I'm just coming on the tail end of finishing To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, which has taken me, I mean, about 7-8 years. So once I get the last of that out of my hair, I'm going to take maybe a month or so off and then assess what I want to tackle next.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Just a reminder, everyone tuning in, we are going to get a special reading from the new book, To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. So please stick around. I'm very excited for that. Take a few more questions first. I do want to ask something, which was, I forgot what it was. Yeah, more broadly, you know, obviously it's a weird time. We're all stuck inside. What, aside from your own work, would you recommend people check out, whether it's a book or a movie or a show you really enjoy?
Ooh, there's so much I could recommend. I mean, on the sci-fi side of things, I would say if you haven't seen the old Babylon 5 TV show, go give that a shot. The first couple episodes are super rocky, the way a lot of shows from the 90s were, but it's really worth sticking with it to get through the first few episodes and get into the rest of the story. One of my all-time top 10 favorite pieces of media, whether it's book, television, whatever, is actually the original television show, the original version of The Prisoner.
Oh yeah, classic.
Classic, and I think it's more relevant than ever nowadays. So if you're looking for some great paranoid, dystopian sci-fi from the British, The Prisoner, 2 thumbs up for me. I've even quoted it in the Inheritance cycle. With the line "Be seeing you," which of course was also used in Babylon 5.
We got another question from the audience, which is, do you find it harder to write now or when you were younger?
It depends. I mean, in some ways it was easier when I was younger because I had no idea what I was doing. And so when you have no idea what you're doing, you're not self-conscious about it. You just do it and you have fun doing it. But the difficulty was it was much harder for me to accomplish the things I wanted to accomplish because I didn't have the skill set. So now my technical skills are much more solid, and that makes it a lot easier in some ways. You know, if I do my homework, if I do my groundwork before going into a story now, it is a lot easier. It's much more, this maybe sounds a little mechanical, but it's almost like coloring in the lines in a way. You have your framework and then you can concentrate on fleshing it out as well as you can.
Here's another one from the audience, from Ethan. He asks, what's your secret to map making?
Oh, I love this. There are actually about 6 or 7 maps in the new book.
Oh, that's good.
And I did 3 or 4 of them myself, and then the rest were done by my assistant, Emanuela, who's absolutely awesome with this. And in fact, I've done all the interior maps for my books over the years. So the thing with maps is you just have to decide what style you want, you know, whether you're going for a traditional fantasy map or a sci-fi map, and then how you want to present the material. There are fortunately a great number of resources on the internet. There's even a great website called thecartographersguild.com. And it's a group of people, and they make imaginary maps for fun. And a lot of them are actually professionals who do stuff for... you know, George R. R. Martin and all sorts of other big projects. So, you know, there are a lot of resources, and whether you do it traditionally or in the computer, just have fun and try to come up with something which matches the style of your writing or matches the style of your story. So it's so you have some continuity between the two of them.
So you said in this book, in the new book, their maps are these more like galactic maps. Because obviously a space map might be different from a land map. It's probably not the right word. I'm not a map expert, unfortunately.
No, I get it. We actually sort of have a mix of all different kinds of maps. Everything from galactic all the way down to right down to the ground level. But it's in appropriate places for the story. Because, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was a kid reading, I loved books where there were illustrations. And you're going through, and every once in a while you get that cool illustration. And I wanted to give that feeling to the readers of this book.
Nice. Here's another one from a reader. And again, if you're just tuning in to Inverse Happy Hour with Chris Paolini, please send us your questions in the comments before we get to the exclusive reading. So someone wants to ask, do you ever take theories from your readers into consideration when writing, especially, I guess, with a series?
Absolutely not. And the reason for that is not because I wouldn't love to, because readers come up with great theories. It's because there's actually a really good legal reason not to these days. If you go onto a fan if you go onto a fan forum or something and you see a theory and then you write that exact thing, you know, it's basically someone else's intellectual property. Now, of course, if you think of it on your own and someone else thought of it, you know, that's fine. But I'd rather not be putting that in my mind in any case. So, you know, it's like with the Inheritance Cycle with the Eragon novels. There was a ton of fan fiction for a time, and I'm really honored and happy that people were writing that. But I really don't need to read fiction about Eragon and Murtagh falling in love with each other.
Fair enough, fair enough. Speaking of Eragon, another question from the audience. Is there any chance of an Eragon film reboot?
Well, the original film was made by a subsidiary of 20th Century Fox, and as viewers may know, Fox was bought by Disney, was it about a year and a half ago? And Disney, which actually means that my elven princess, Arya, is now technically a Disney princess.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you. I'm very proud of that. So we'd had some hope that maybe Disney would jump on it, but at the moment there hasn't been any movement on that. But I maintain hope. Things are very unsettled in the entertainment business right now because of the coronavirus and because of everything happening. And Disney is looking for a lot of content, both for Disney Plus and the film side. So we'll see. That said, if we do get a new film, I can guarantee I will be writing the screenplay and writing the project as hard as I can just to make sure that it goes the way it should.
Nice, nice. Let me ask you one more.
I'm seeing lots of questions about the beard, and I'll just say this is the self-isolation quarantine beard. I've had a beard for a while, but with everything going on, I decided to just go full wizard.
I like it. Although you're keeping it clean. It's not, you know, it's a little, you know, it's not too scraggly. It looks good.
No. I haven't trimmed it for like 3 months, so it's just kind of holding.
Oh, very impressive. Even better. All right, let me ask you one other question that I was curious about, and then unless something else comes in, we can jump to the reading. So when I was doing a bit of research, I noticed that you said that this is a story you've been working on for a long time. I think it said 10 years. So I'm curious, what's the process been like for you of working on one novel over the course of 10 years, obviously with other projects in between?
Yeah. I mean, the glib answer is torturous. The not glib answer is that it was a process of basically relearning how to tell a story from scratch. Because when I worked on the Inheritance Cycle, you know, I started working on the outline for that series and the first book all the way back in 1998. And I didn't finish the final book until 2011. And even though I'd come up with other story ideas during that time, my storytelling skills kind of got rusty, you know, in a way. And so starting on a new project, something completely from scratch, I had to do a couple of different versions of the book in order to figure out what I was trying to say, what the story actually was. And that was a valuable lesson. And it's one I've been able to apply to new stories, such as like the ones in Fork Witch Worm and future projects, so that I never have to go through that sort of iterative process again. But that, on top of that, it's a completely different genre, and I wanted to have a certain level of understanding about the science and the physics that I didn't when I started. I mean, I was homeschooled. I never went to college. I've been writing my whole life, and I have a pretty good grounding in science, but I needed to be several levels ahead of where I was, and so that meant almost a full year of talking with scientists, physics research, just thinking and writing and figuring out the framework for the world. And I don't want to scare people off, because the book is not a science book. You know, it's not a textbook. All of the world building is there to support the characters and the story, but it's still important, because just as the rules of magic shape a fantasy novel, the rules of science that you were playing with in a science fiction novel shape your world also and shape the story.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. Do you think there's a difference there? With fantasy, obviously, you can, make the magic up a bit. With science, with sci-fi, do you feel like it needs to be grounded in real science, or is there a bit of both?
I mean, it depends on the type of science fiction you try to write. If you
Sure.
write sci-fi fantasy, essentially, you can just come up with your own rules and say, it's happening. But, you use technobabble, essentially. And that is a perfectly acceptable approach for science fiction. Although the only thing is whatever your approach is, as a reader, as an audience member myself, I just beg everyone, please, please just be consistent with the rules you create.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I really wanted to, because my book takes place in the real world. It's just set in the future. So everything that happens now, all of known history exists in my book. And because of that, I didn't want to contradict known physics. Things that have been proven that we know are real, I didn't want to contradict that. So figuring out how to do something like faster than light travel without contradicting Einstein takes some serious mental energy, I'll tell you. And on top of that, without using some system or idea that's been used by another author or another television series or something, because it's easy to go and say, okay, they're using warp drive or they're using hyperdrive. But that raises questions of time travel, and it's a little lazy. So all of that played into the research I did and what I was trying to accomplish. And of course, I have my own ideas about the role technology plays and where I think humanity is going and what we may or may not accomplish. And that is sort of in the background in the story also.
Yeah. Just one more question, because it came up while you were talking. I think it's connected, from Ethan, who asked you, how did you come up with the magical system of Aragorn, which he calls the most viable magical system he has seen?
Awesome. I mean, a couple of different ways. I mean, originally there is an old tradition, both in classical fantasy and then moving back into myths and legends, of words having power. If you know the true name of something and you speak the name, you have power over that person or object. So I was certainly not the person to come up with that idea. But when I started using that idea and really thinking about it, I wanted to, again, keep it grounded in physics as much as possible. And so the only real breaking of physics that occurs in my fantasy novels is the assumption that living creatures, whether they're sentient, self-aware or not, living creatures have the ability to directly manipulate forms of energy with their minds. And that's magic. And then everything else sort of follows from that, conservation of energy, what is and isn't possible with that energy. And I tried to be as consistent as I could be. Now, what is consistency may depend on who's reading the book and how you define some of the rules, but I really put a lot of thought into that. And it makes me happy when I'm writing, because then I can find little exceptions that was like, well, if you word it this way, maybe you can do something to effect.
Nice. All right. Well, I think let's get to the great stuff here. I'm really excited this conversation has been awesome. I'm really excited, especially after hearing about this new book, to now hear you read a passage from it.
Well, I won't lie. I'm a little nervous here because...
Oh, really? This is the first time you've read it out loud to an audience, correct?
Correct. Well, I did a very small reading in front of a bookstore audience, about 4 years ago or something.
Oh, wow.
Like a couple of paragraphs, which have changed.
Sure.
So this is really the first serious official reading I've done. I'm probably going to stumble over my tongue a couple of times because this is a raw reading. And in fact, I was editing this section just about a week ago.
Wow.
And I even have, I don't know if you can see it, I even have editing marks on the side of the document here.
Nice.
So before I start, I'm going to give a little
context,
because we're going to start in the middle of the scene. My main character is a woman by the name of Kira, and she is on an alien moon that's being surveyed for a potential colony. And she's been out on her survey, and she has fallen into a cave that shouldn't be there. And the cave is very much artificial. It's obvious that it was built, and she's just sort of looking around, taking in this artificial chamber that really should not be there and was not built by humans. So
this is pretty early into the. This is like pretty early in the story.
Yeah, I mean, this is page. I want to say it's page 20, if that.
Got it. All right.
Yeah, this is pretty early in the book. All right, here goes.
Crack! Kira glanced toward the sound, just in time to see a melon-sized rock dropping toward her from an opening in the ceiling. She yelped and stumbled forward awkwardly. Her legs tangled, and she fell onto her chest, hard. The rock slammed into the floor behind her, sending up a hazy billow of dust. It took Kira a second to catch her breath. Her pulse was hammering again, and at any moment she expected alarms to sound and some hideously effective countermeasure to dispose of her. But nothing else happened. No alarms blared, no lights flashed, no trapdoors opened up beneath her, no lasers poked her full of tiny holes. She pushed herself back onto her feet, ignoring the pain. The dust was soft beneath her boots, and it dampened the noise so that the only sound she heard was her feathered breathing. The pedestal was right in front of her. Damn it, Kira thought. She should have been more careful. Her instructors back in school would have ripped her a new one for falling, even if it was a mistake. She returned her attention to the pedestal. The depression in the top reminded her of a water basin. Beneath the pooled dust were more lines scribed across the inner curve of the hollow. And, as she looked closer, there seemed to be a faint blue glow emanating from them, soft and diffuse beneath the pollen-like particles. Her curiosity surged. Bioluminescence? Or was it powered by an artificial source? From outside the structure, she heard the rising roar of the shuttle's engines. She didn't have long, no more than a minute or two. Kira sucked on her lip. If only she could see more of the basin. She knew what she was about to do was wrong, but she couldn't help it. She had to learn something about this amazing artifact. She wasn't so stupid as to touch the dust. That was the sort of rookie mistake that got people eaten or infected or dissolved by acid. Instead, she took the small canister of compressed air off her belt and used it to gently blow the dust away from the edge of the basin. The dust flew up in swirled plumes, exposing the lines beneath. They were glowing, with an eerie hue that reminded her of an electrical discharge. Kira shivered again, but not from cold. It felt as if she were intruding upon forbidden ground. Enough. She'd tempted fate far more than was wise. Time to make a strategic retreat. She turned to leave the pedestal. A jolt ran up her leg as her right foot remained stuck to the floor. She yelped, surprised, and fell to one knee. As she did, the Achilles tendon in her frozen ankle wrenched and tore, and she uttered a howl. Blinking back tears, Kira looked down at her foot. Dust. A pile of black dust covered her foot. Moving, seething dust. It was pouring out of the basin, down the pedestal, and onto her foot. Even as she watched, it started to creep up her leg, following the contours of her muscles. Kira yelled and tried to yank her leg free, but the dust held her in place as securely as a maglock. She tore off her belt, doubled it over, and used it to slap at the featureless mass. The blows failed to knock any of the dust loose. "Nagar!" she shouted. "Help!" Her heart pounding so loudly she could hear nothing else, Kira stretched the belt flat between her hands and tried to use it like a scraper on her thigh. The edge of the belt left a shallow impression on the dust, but otherwise had no effect. The swarm of particles had already reached the crease of her hip. She could feel them pressing in around her leg like a series of tight, ever-shifting bands. Kira didn't want to, but she had no other choice. With her right hand, she tried to grab the dust and pull it away. Her fingers sank into the swarm of particles as easily as foam. There was nothing to grab hold of, and when she drew her hand back, the dust came with it, wrapping around her fingers with ropey tendrils. Ah! She scrubbed her hand against the floor, but to no avail. Fear spiked through her as she felt something tickle her wrist, and she knew that the dust had found its way through the seams of her glove. Emergency override. Seal all cuffs. Kira had difficulty saying the words. Her mouth was dry, and her tongue seemed twice its normal size. Her suit responded instantly, tightening around each of her joints, including her neck, and forming airtight seals with her skin. It wasn't enough to stop the dust. Kira felt the cold tickle progress up her arm to her elbow, and then passed. "Mayday! Mayday!" she shouted. "Mayday! Nagar! Geiger! Mayday! Can anyone hear me? Help!" Outside the suit, the dust flowed over her visor, plunging her into darkness. Inside the suit, the tendrils wormed their way over her shoulder and across her neck and chest. Unreasoning terror gripped Kira, terror and abhorrence. She jerked on her leg with all her strength. Something snapped in her ankle, but her foot remained anchored to the floor. She screamed and clawed at her visor, trying to clear it off. The dust oozed across her cheek and toward the front of her face. She screamed again, and then clamped her mouth shut, closed off her throat, and held her breath. Her heart felt as if it were going to explode. Nagar! The dust crept over her eyes, like the feet of 1,000 tiny insects. A moment later, it covered her mouth, and when it came, the dry, squirming touch within her nostrils was no less horrible than she had imagined. Stupid! Shouldn't have! Alan! Kira saw his face in front of her, and along with her fear, she felt an overwhelming sense of unfairness. This wasn't supposed to be how things ended. Then the weight in her throat became too great, and she opened her mouth to scream as the torrent of dust rushed inside of her. And all went blank. It's not horror. Maybe a little horror, but it's not horror. I hope you enjoyed that reading, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the book.